folks. I've got 3:30. Let's go ahead and get started today. Hope everybody's doing well. We're headed into the last chapter in this section of the class. And the last theory we're dealing with, Aristotle's virtue ethics, which is fairly different than most of the theories that we've covered up to this point. So it is, again, a good time to kind of stop and take stock and be able to think about what's different from Aristotle's theory compared to the ones we've been looking at, especially deontology and utilitarianism. Because one of the main criticisms of virtue ethics basically comes from modern moral theorists, and the idea is that virtue ethics can't guide action. Right? So I'll come back and talk about that a little bit, but last time I suggested kind of creating a chart to keep some of this stuff straight, so let's just go ahead and do that here. So I've got some basic things laid out here. I'll switch cameras so people on Zoom can see it, that I mentioned in the introductory lecture, and to keep in mind about all the different moral theories that we're looking at here. So some basic points of comparison and contrast between them. So we looked at social contract theory first. And the main normative standard, the prescriptive standard according to social contract theory, at least the version of it that we looked at, was rational self-interest. With regard to intrinsic value, we saw that because contract theory is one of the only anti-realist approaches to normative ethics that we looked at, that there is a problem accounting for intrinsic value. There's a question mark about whether anything has intrinsic value according to social contract theory. Maybe it's the cooperation, and even those that we cooperate with just have instrumental value to me. Remember that objection. So, can social contract account for the intrinsic value? It's a big question for us. There is a way to think of this theory as a teleological theory. It's not consequentialist, obviously, because it's contract-based rather than about the consequences of the action. But it is teleological in the sense that I'm trying to maximize self-interest, my own self-interest. And it's basically an act theory. Actions that are wrong are ones that we didn't agree to, or based on norms that we didn't agree to. Right. So it's the basics of social contract theory. Then we got to deontology. What was the standard, the main idea in deontology? The categorical what? Yeah, categorical imperative. Anybody remember what had intrinsic value according to Kant? Goodwill. The goodwill and rational agents, right? It was non-teleological and non-consequentialist. It's a deontic theory. Right conduct is based on whether the maxim can be universalized or whether the maxim involves using anybody as a mere means, a rational agent as a mere means. And it's a character, or excuse me, it's an action-based theory, trying to distinguish permissible and impermissible obligatory actions. Then we just got finished with utilitarianism. What's the basic idea or standard of right conduct in according to utilitarianism? I'm sorry? Yeah, the utility principle or the greatest happiness principle. intrinsic value, at least for the classical utilitarians. Anybody remember not rational persons, but what? What are we supposed to maximize? Pleasure. Pleasure. It is teleological, as we just said. The idea is to maximize utility is the goal. And it's, again, an action-based theory. It's trying to answer the question, what ought I do? Yeah, I'll come back and distinguish those here in a minute. So that's the basics of where we've come so far. Does anybody have questions about any of those? Yeah.
What do you mean by GHP?
Greatest happiness principle.
Okay.
Or utility principle. Anybody on Zoom have a question about that setup? So, modern moral philosophy, these three, but really the two big camps, 1 and 2, are utilitarianism and deontology. Notice they're both action-based theories. In fact, all those modern theories are action-based theories. They're attempting to answer the question, what ought I do? The categorical imperative and the greatest happiness principle provide us the standard for answering that question, right? At least ostensibly. And then here are the basics of virtue ethics, which we'll be looking at in this unit. And mostly we're going to be worried about Aristotle's version of virtue ethics. What's the basic normative standard according to Aristotle? Not the golden rule, but what? I'm sorry?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. What's the basic normative standard or prescriptive standard according to Aristotle? Not the golden rule, but the golden what? The golden mean. The golden rule says treat others as you would want them to treat you, but the golden mean identifies vices and virtues, character traits. So, intrinsic good, virtue, sorry, eudaimonia, which usually gets translated as happiness, but a better translation is probably human flourishing. It's teleological. Human flourishing is the goal. We want to cultivate the character traits required for human flourishing. But it is not consequentialist. Consequentialists say what's important about an action are the consequences of that action. Morally speaking, what's important about it. But according to Aristotle's ethics, he's not primarily worried about action. He's worried about the character traits of the agent performing the action. So the deontologists, they're worried about maxims. Utilitarians about consequences. Aristotelians and virtue ethicists are worried about character. So this theory is not attempting to answer the question, what ought I do? It's trying to answer the question, how should I live? Or what kind of person should I be? So first big difference between Aristotle and modern moral philosophy is that Aristotle's got a character-based theories and they've got act-based theories. So let's pause there and think about that for a second. So what ought I do? So let's do it this way. Action-based theory. And down here with the character-based. The object of evaluation. So we've got two action-based theories. Let's make it easier. Two basic action-based theories: utilitarianism, deontology. Utilitarianism says the object of evaluation is the consequence of the action. Or the consequence of the rule under which the action might follow, right? According to deontology, it's the maxim of the action. So we're looking at consequences and trying to calculate alternative courses, the utility of alternative courses of action, or we're trying to figure out if we can will the maxim as a universal law without contradiction, right? And both of those criteria, both of those, are supposed to help us distinguish actions that are permissible impermissible or obligatory. So the question is, what ought I do? Which of my actions is permissible, impermissible, or obligatory? Right? And then again, we're looking at the universalizability test or calculating utility to answer that. Right? For character-based theories, if the question is, how should I live or what kind of person should I be? The object of evaluation is not the action, the consequence of the action or the maximum, but the character of the actor. The character traits of the agent performing the act. Not the action itself. So it's almost like Aristotle playing a bit of a different game. So now what we're worried about is not actions that are permissible, impermissible, or obligatory, but character traits that are virtuous or vicious. Vices are negative character traits. Virtues are positive character traits. So virtue ethics is coming at the issue of morality in a much different way, starting out in a much different way from a different question than the act-based theorists are. Questions about that? So one of the big questions is just going to be like, look, Aristotle doesn't help us with murderers at the door, or trolley problems, or terrorist tanks, or any of those sorts of hypotheticals that we've been looking at. In fact, Aristotle might think, well, man, moral philosophy is in pretty bad shape if that's what they're focused on in the first place, right? All right, so that's how Aristotle's theory and virtue ethics in general are a little bit different than act-based theories, all right? And then Again, what we're going to worry about is Aristotle's version, but there are different versions of virtue ethics as well. And so let me just mention a basic distinction here as well. And so this gets to Aristotle's notion of virtue here. Aristotle conceives of virtue as a character trait required for flourishing. So there are character traits like prudence, patience that are just as essential to the flourishing of a human being as water is to the flourishing of a plant. Right? And so that's Aristotle's idea of a virtue. David Hume, it's a figure we haven't looked at a whole lot, but I did talk about him with the is-ought problem back in the metaphysics section. He thinks of virtues as useful character traits to others and for the possessor of the trait. So different ways of thinking about what a virtue is then, right? Aristotle says it's a character trait required for human flourishing. Hume's notion doesn't make reference to human flourishing at all. It's just whether it's useful or not for social intercourse, to the person or to others. So what we're worried about here is this Aristotelian version of it. And the other thing that's very different from between Aristotle and the folks that we've been looking at is that the folks we've been looking at, they typically conceive of individuals in a modern way. You're a fully formed rational individual first and a member of society second. But for Aristotle, you're a social being from the ground up. It's part of your nature, right? And the other thing is that all of nature and human beings included in that nature are teleologically ordered. This is a pre-modern view. And so one of the problems that contemporary Aristotelians have is like, look, if Aristotle's virtue ethics presupposes this metaphysics that's at odds with most of modern science, how could we ever revive or how could we save his moral theory in any way, right? So this is a big problem there. There are people that work on that. So this teleological structure is very different as well. And going along with that, notion's function argument is easy to misunderstand. So think about it this way. Again, go back to that plant analogy. We've got human nature. Let's call it untutored or undisciplined human nature, but it does have a rational capacity. And it defines its essence. And down here we have human nature, if perfected. Sometimes some versions of virtue ethics are called perfectionist versions because what we're really trying to do is perfect human nature, right? So this is human flourishing down here then. So this is the telos. And in order to get from an animal with a bunch of drives and it includes the capacity of reason, I have to use that reason to identify virtues that will allow me to flourish or are required for me to flourish and to avoid vices. Now, the thing that's difficult to understand or that a lot of people misunderstand at the outset is Aristotle's idea of the function argument, which has to do with his view of human nature. So notice the language I'm using here. I don't mean Chris Blakely with my particular personality. I mean Chris Blakely is a member of a certain kind of species that has some traits that define that species biologically and metaphysically rationality. All right. So in order to get from here and to pursue happiness, I necessarily have to identify the golden mean, right? So that's the basic idea. So it's not like the function argument has to do with the function that I pick for myself, like picking a major or a job or a career. It's the kind of thing that I am in virtue of being a human being. So Aristotle says all human beings by nature are inclined towards happiness. They get confused about what happiness is. They think it's pleasure, but it's really not pleasure. It's this excellence of function stuff. Pleasure is not a bad thing, but too much of it, then you undermine your rationality or something like that, and then that's bad. So, which articles did y'all read for today? Anybody read Quagmire? You read Quagmire, right? Quagmire. What's Quagmire's problem? He's a pervert. Pursues sexual pleasure for its own sake, and so much so that he's pained by the absence of sexual pleasure, right? And he also uses sex for like recreation rather than reproduction, which Aristotle has a problem with as well. So his sexual desire has become unordered around the telos of sexuality, natural human reproduction. So that's what makes him a pervert. He's misusing his organs. Anybody read the humor one from The Office? Yeah, so that one's the wit is the mean there. So we get Jim, and then the bore, someone that can't tell a joke, take a joke, or can't suffer people having a good time is Dwight, right? And then the person that's a slave to their own sense of humor is Michael Scott, right? So basic ideas there. Anybody have questions about that basic setup? All right, let's take a look here. So to get kind of warmed up, we switch cameras.